The week my father died, my sister Renata called a family meeting at his house and didn't tell me about it until it was over. I found out from my cousin Darlene, who texted me a photo of everyone sitting around my father's dining room table. His chair was still at the head of it. Renata was sitting in it. I stared at that photo for a long time. There were 11 people in that room, people who had driven hours to be there, and not one of them had called me. When I asked Renata about it, she said she hadn't wanted to overwhelm me. She said I'd been so involved in the caregiving that she thought I needed rest. She said it in the kind of voice you use with someone who's been a little fragile, a little too emotional, someone you love but don't quite take seriously. I said I understood. I didn't make a scene. I never made scenes with Renata. There was no point. She was 12 years older than me, and she had decided a long time ago which one of us was capable and which one of us needed protecting. She'd decided I was the one who needed protecting. The rest of the family followed her lead. What none of them knew, what Renata had never once asked about, was that my father and I had been having a different kind of conversation for the last 3 years of his life. Not about his health, about his assets. He had shown me things he hadn't shown anyone else. That was still my secret when I walked into his house the morning after that photo was taken and found Renata already going through his desk. My father's name was Bernard. He was not a man who explained himself. He worked for 40 years, spent carefully, and built quietly. A commercial property he'd purchased in 1987 that had tripled in value. 4 rental units, paid off completely. A brokerage account he'd been funding since before I was born. Renata knew about most of it. She had a finance background, and my father had always let her handle the visible parts, the quarterly distributions, the conversations with Gerald the attorney, the annual tax meetings with his accountant Philip. She was the competent one. That was the family story, and nobody questioned it, including me, for a long time. What Renata didn't know was that 3 years before my father died, he had called me on a Tuesday evening and asked me to come over. Not for a medical appointment, just to sit with him. We sat at his kitchen table, and he pushed a folder across to me. Inside was a document I hadn't seen before. A separate trust. Not the family trust Renata helped administer. A smaller, independent structure he had set up quietly through a different attorney 15 years earlier. It held one asset, a piece of undeveloped land on the eastern edge of the county. 44 acres he'd bought for almost nothing in 1994 and never mentioned to anyone. The land had been rezoned 2 years before that Tuesday evening. It was now worth more than everything else he owned combined. He told me the trust named me as sole beneficiary. He told me he'd chosen me because he trusted me to be quiet about it. He told me not to tell Renata. Then he asked me how the coffee was, and we talked about something else. I kept that folder in a fireproof box under my bed for 3 years. I never told anyone, not even Curtis. So when Renata sat in my father's chair and ran her family meeting and left me out of it, she was making decisions about an estate she didn't fully understand. And I let her. The morning I found her at his desk, she looked up and said, "I'm just getting organized." She said it the way you'd explain something to a child who had wandered into the room. She had stacks of folders already sorted. She had a legal pad with a list. I asked if she needed help. She said she had it covered. I made coffee and sat in the living room while she worked. I could hear her opening drawers. She never found the right one. The weeks after my father's funeral were a lesson in what people assume when they've already decided who you are. Renata held a second gathering. She called it a family coordination meeting, at her own house this time. I was invited to that one. I sat at her dining room table with 4 cousins, Curtis on speakerphone from Phoenix, and Gerald, the attorney, who had driven 40 minutes to be there. Renata presented what she called the estate overview. She had a printed packet. There was not a packet at my seat. When I asked for one, she slid a copy down the table to me without looking up. Gerald walked through the trust structure, the commercial property, the rentals, the brokerage account, the three-way split between me, Renata, and Curtis. At one point, Gerald mentioned that the process would go smoothly as long as all parties were cooperative and didn't create unnecessary complications. He looked at Renata when he said it. Then, for just a moment, he looked at me. I understood what that meant. I was the one they were worried about. The emotional one. The one who might cause problems. I nodded and wrote something on the edge of my paper. After Gerald finished, Renata's husband Dale made coffee, and everyone relaxed into side conversations. I heard my cousin Patrice tell someone that Renata had already been talking to a commercial real estate broker about the property. I heard Dale say something about timing the market. I heard the word finally used more than once, in the easy way people talk when they think the hard part is behind them. At one point, my Aunt Joyce pulled me aside near the kitchen doorway and patted my arm and said, "It's good that Renata is here to handle all this. You did your part, sweetheart. You took such good care of him." She meant it kindly. That almost made it worse. Nobody asked me anything. Nobody looked at me like I had anything worth hearing. On the drive home, I thought about the folder in the fireproof box, the separate trust, the 44 acres, the attorney who had drafted it, a woman named Louise, who had called me 6 months after my father's first stroke to make sure I still had her number. I still had her number. I called her the next morning. Louise had been waiting for my call longer than I realized. She had drafted the separate trust herself, and she walked me through everything I needed to understand in a single 2-hour meeting. The trust was clean. The transfer was automatic upon my father's death. The land was already mine. Then she said something that stopped me. She said there was one issue we needed to get ahead of quickly. A week before my father died, someone had contacted the county assessor's office requesting ownership records on that parcel. Louise didn't know who. She said it could be nothing, routine, a title company, a developer doing market research. But she said if someone in the family had started pulling records, and if they moved fast, there was a narrow window in which a challenge could be filed, claiming the separate trust had been established without full disclosure to the primary estate. It wasn't a strong challenge, but it was a possible one. She said we needed to file a formal notice of trust administration immediately, and we needed to do it before anyone else made a move. I drove home and sat at my kitchen table and thought about who in my family had the instinct to pull county records within a week of my father's death. I thought about Renata's legal pad, her stacks of sorted folders, her son, Marcus, who had recently started describing himself as being in real estate. Louise filed the notice 3 days later. I thought that would be the end of the uncertainty. It wasn't. 2 days after Louise filed, she called me back. Her voice was careful. She said a title research firm had submitted a formal ownership inquiry on the parcel that same morning, just hours after our notice posted. She said that kind of timing wasn't accidental. Someone had been watching the county records system. Someone had set up an alert. I sat down. Louise said whoever it was hadn't filed anything yet, but she said they were clearly preparing to. She said if they had an attorney ready and moved within the week, they could still file a competing claim, arguing the separate trust had been concealed from the primary estate. She said it would almost certainly fail. She said almost. I asked her what we needed.
She said we needed to move faster than they were moving. She spent the next 4 days pulling every document my father had ever signed in connection with that land. The original purchase, the trust formation, 2 subsequent appraisals he'd quietly commissioned, a letter he had written and signed and notarized 14 years earlier, stating clearly that the parcel was intentionally excluded from his primary estate and held separately for reasons of his own choosing. That letter was the one that mattered.
Louise said once she filed it as a supplemental exhibit, any competing claim would have nothing to stand on. She filed it on a Friday afternoon. I didn't hear anything over the weekend. I checked my phone every few hours. I slept badly. I kept thinking about Marcus at that coordination meeting, watching everything, saying nothing. I kept thinking about the way Renata had looked at Gerald when he mentioned proper channels, like the idea of an obstacle was something she simply hadn't budgeted for. Monday morning, Louise called and said the title firm had withdrawn their inquiry. I stood at my kitchen window and looked at the backyard for a long time. Whatever door they'd been trying to open was closed now. The land was mine, fully, finally, without question. But the family kept moving, completely unaware of how close they had come to stumbling onto something that would have changed everything. Renata had already met with the commercial broker twice. She sent a group email outlining a proposed timeline for selling the rental units. She had forwarded Gerald's information to Curtis as though she were managing him. She was building momentum, building certainty, the kind of certainty that comes from believing you already know everything there is to know. In early December, she organized a memorial dinner, a formal one, a restaurant my father had liked. 12 people around a long table. Renata sat at the head of the table. She gave a toast. She talked about legacy and stewardship and responsibility. She used the word we throughout, but looked mostly at Dale and Marcus when she said it. I was seated at the far end, between 2 cousins I barely knew. At some point, Marcus leaned across the table and asked me if I'd thought about what I was going to do with my distribution. He asked it the way you ask someone what they plan to do with a gift card. I said I hadn't decided yet. He nodded, the way people nod when they've already stopped listening. Halfway through dinner, Dale stood up and said he had a small announcement. He said that he and Renata had been in serious conversations with a developer about the commercial property and that they expected to have a letter of intent before the new year. People clapped. My Aunt Joyce said, "Bernard would be so proud." Someone said it was about time that property was put to good use. I looked down at my plate. Then Gerald cleared his throat. He said he wanted to remind everyone that any transaction involving estate assets would need to go through proper channels, and that all beneficiaries would need to be informed and in agreement. Dale waved his hand and said, Of course, of course." Renata smiled at Gerald, the way you smile at someone who's being careful for no reason. Then she looked down the table at me. It was a brief look, a checking look, the kind you give someone when you want to confirm they are still small and still quiet and still not a problem. I held her gaze for just a moment longer than she expected. She looked away first. After dinner, when people were finishing their coffee and putting on their coats, I asked Gerald if I could have 5 minutes. We stepped to a quieter corner near the entrance. I told him there was an asset in my father's estate he wasn't aware of. I told him about the separate trust. I told him about the land. I told him Louise's name, and told him the filing had already been made. Gerald went very still. I told him the appraised value. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, "Does Renata know?" I said, "She's about to." I walked back to the table. Everyone was still there, coats half on, finishing conversations. Renata was laughing at something Dale had said. Marcus was on his phone. I stood at the end of the table and I said, Before everyone leaves, I want to share something about Dad's estate. The table got quiet. I told them about the trust. I told them about the land. I told them the acreage, the year our father had purchased it, the rezoning, and the appraised value. I watched their faces as the number landed. Renata stopped smiling. Dale's hand went still on the table. Marcus looked up from his phone. My Aunt Joyce said, "Bernard owned that land." I said he had, for 30 years, and he had left it to me, directly, in a separate trust filed with a separate attorney, structured so that it transferred automatically and could not be contested through the family estate. Renata said, "That can't be right." I said she was welcome to have it independently verified. She said, "Dad would have told me." And there it was, said out loud, in front of everyone who had ever agreed with her. Dad would have told me, because I was the one who mattered. Because you don't trust the youngest one with the important things. I said, "He told me 3 years ago. He asked me not to say anything." Nobody spoke. Gerald was still standing near the entrance. He did not look surprised. He looked like a man watching something arrive that had been on its way for a long time. The land sold 14 months later. The number was real. Renata and I have not had dinner together since that night. Curtis called from Phoenix after it all settled. He said he was glad I got something good out of it. I think he meant it. I still have the folder, the one my father pushed across the table on that Tuesday evening. Sometimes I take it out and just hold it for a minute. Not because of what it's worth. Because of the way he looked at me when he gave it to me, like he knew exactly what he was doing. He always did.